Hello, this video continues my CFA series, and I'll look at three classic measures of portfolio return, starting with a fundamental building block, the holding period return, which we will need as an input into calculating the time-weighted return. So we will link or chain together the holding period returns to get the time-weighted return, and this time-weighted return will be indifferent to, will not incorporate any outside additions or withdrawals from the portfolio. However, the third measure, the money or dollar weighted return, will incorporate external additions or withdrawals from the portfolio. So I'll show you a simple example and then a more realistic example, and we'll also address the question, which is the better measure if our goal is to evaluate the performance of the investment manager? So a fundamental building block in portfolio return measurement is the holding period return. This is the return earned by an investor over a specific holding period for an investment that makes one cash payment at the end of the holding period. That's the definition in the syllabus at this point, but I will say that it doesn't need to be just one cash payment. It's any cash payment during the holding period. So I would say there's two key aspects to the holding period return from my perspective. The first pertains to this cash payment, and the idea is that whatever is the holding period, we want to include the cash, which we would otherwise call income received, or if it's a stock, for example, that would be the dividend. So what we're saying on that first point is we want to make sure that any dividends or cash received during the period are including in the holding period return, because really it's analogous to, if we think about the equity asset class, total shareholder return. If you're the investor, that's what you care about. It's not just price appreciation, but it would also be dividend or income received along the way, total shareholder return. The second aspect I think is very important, and that's the fact that it's a holding period of some unspecified duration or interval. What that means is that a holding period return is not an annualized number. And I see this mistake made often, right? It's not in this calculation, we're going to see it's a 15.5%. But because it's a holding period return, we don't want to assume that that is a per annum. We definitely don't want to assume that is an annualized number. The holding period return is over some period. That could be 1 day, 1 week, 1 month. It might be a year by coincidence, but it could be 2 years or 5 years. So that the longer the holding period is for a given holding period return, if I told you 15.5% is the holding period return, that's much more impressive if the holding period is 1 week or 1 month, isn't it? Than if the holding period is 2 years, or if the holding period is 10 years. Well, actually, that's not impressive. We didn't even keep pace with inflation. So very important that I think that's the essential characteristic of a holding period. It's not annualized. It's over some period. And for that reason, I think if you want to specify a holding period return, you really almost by necessity need to accompany it with what the holding period duration or length of the time interval is. So in this simple example, an initial investment of $100 grows to $112 at the end of the period. And in my examples, we'll just assume the period is 1 year because it keeps it easy. So let's say at the end of the year, and we receive the cash dividend of $3.50. So what's the holding period return? Well, that's 15.5%, such that I'll just show with my calculator here. I'm going to open parens, say 112 plus the 350 received minus the 100. That's close parens on my numerator, and I divide by the beginning price, right? Not the end. And I get my 15.5%. Now, we have the holding period return, which we will use for one of the following two measures. And so we'll look at both the money-weighted return and the time-weighted return. And for that, I'll use a single simple example, and then I'll conclude with a bit more of an elaborate, more realistic example. But my simple example here has three points on the time frame, time equals 0, is we usually start at the initial time 0 today, where we're going to buy 1 share and the price is $100. Then at the end of this first period, which we could also think of as the beginning of the second period, that share will pay a single dividend of $3, and then we decide to buy an additional share when the price has gone up to $119. And then we go to the second time point on the timeline. So this would be the end of the second period, or we could think of it as the beginning of the third period. And now because we bought a second share, we're going to collect 2 dividends. The dividend has not been raised in the meantime. It's unchanged dividend, but we have 2 shares. So we're going to receive dividend income of $6. And now we're going to sell both shares when the price is further increased at the end of the second period to $124. So we'll collect $248. And then the question is, what's our return given this scenario? And it turns out there's more than one answer. First, we could look at the money-weighted return. And the money-weighted return, so what I want you to know is that's the same really as the internal rate of return, IRR, and it's a function on the calculator. I'll show you that in just a second. So the money-weighted rate of return is the IRR because it accounts for the timing amount of all the cash flows in and out of the portfolio. So if I represent it here in a way that's similar in the CFA syllabus, you can see here with our time 0, 1, and 2, and all transactions are listed. So we actually have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 transactions listed, and we're going to see that the money-weighted return is 11.6%. However, here's my representation of that timeline horizontal, and you can see what I have here in the top row is just a single or per share perspective, right? Here's the price going 100, at the end of the first period increasing to 119, and then increasing further to 124, and also along the way, dividend of $3 getting paid, but I'm only on a per share basis here. So that here we represent going down schematically the actual cash flows. So $100 is spent, then we purchase, so that's a cash outflow and negative. At the end of the first period, we purchase another share at 119, so that's a cash outflow. But also here at the end of the first period, we're also receiving that first dividend, so it's a cash inflow as a positive value. And then I go to the end of the second period, and I'm receiving 2 dividends, or we as the investor receiving 2 dividends, and also we're selling both shares, so that's cash inflow of $248. So you see how this is the per share horizontal timeline, and then these are the actual cash flows per each of these transactions. So that for the money-weighted return, the critical thing that we need to do is aggregate the net cash flows on one, in this case, one row, so that we have the correct net cash flow at each point in time. And if you paid attention, if you viewed our earlier video from my CFA series, you know that we're invoking here the cash additivity principle, which we oftentimes do that knowingly without knowing that we're philosophically using the cash additivity principle, which is that cash flows that occur at the same point in time, that, for example, right here, at that point in time when we purchase a second share for $119, but also collect a dividend of $3, we can add those together. So we do that implicitly without knowing. You may not even know that that has a name, the cash additivity principle. So this row here, then, we need that to be correctly specified, that in terms of net cash flows, right? The net means we're netting we're netting inflows and outflows, so that for the 2 periods here, starting from 0, we really only have 3 net cash flows. The $100 that is a outflow when we purchase the first share, and then here at the end of the first period, we have a net flow of $116 because we purchased the share, but we received a dividend. And so I will alert you here to an assumption that's easy to gloss over, and I didn't make anything of it when I set the problem up, and that is that where it didn't reinvest the dividend. Did you notice that? This $3 is really being used to purchase a share, so it wasn't an automatic reinvestment of the dividend. So we have 116 here, and then at the end of the second period, the collection of both dividends and a sale of the share. Although we don't really necessarily need to liquidate at the end of the second period here because we're computing our return. So it's this could be an unrealized value where we're evaluating, or it's a valuation of these shares at this point in time for purposes of portfolio return measurement. So now that we have the three net cash flows specified for these transactions, we can compute the dollar weighted return. And if I bring the calculator out here, I'm going to use the cash flow worksheet. So that's my CF key. And then my first step, said this before, first tip for this cash flow worksheet is to clear it. Second, clear work, because I did have legacy values in there and they will interfere with my calculation because the calculator is going to assume what's already got in there. I need to clear. It doesn't, I sometimes clear it twice because I'm so insecure. But then I want my inputs for my CF0, that is today, or the first cash outflow, and I'm going to negate it with my negative sign here to make sure that I indicate directionally I got it correct. I hit enter. I like to look for a little triangle that confirms that I've entered into the cash flow worksheet, and then I can move to the next point in time, and that's a negative 116. Negate it, enter, and then I can move, well, actually, only a frequency 1, so I skip that, and then I go to my into the second period is 254, but that's positive. I enter that, and I'm ready to retrieve the internal rate of return, which is the dollar weighted return by just hitting compute. Calculator does it for me. And you may have noticed there's a synonyms. Money weighted return is a synonym for dollar weighted return, and my 11.5995 is the same as what I've rounded here in my Excel exhibit, which is 11.6%. So we've got the money weighted return correctly specified, and then we'll look at the time weighted return. The time weighted return measures the compound rate growth of a dollar initially invested in the portfolio over a stated measurement period. Unlike that dollar weighted return, it is not affected by cash withdrawals or additions to the portfolio. So the definition reflects the label that it returns the returns. It refers to returns that are averaged over time. So our steps here for the time weighted return are prior to the price the portfolio prior to significant fund additions or withdrawals. We first divide the evaluation period into sub-periods by timing of the cash flow. So that's generally what we do. If we have a long period, we would generally slice it into sub-periods, and the sub-periods are basically defined by any significant cash flows. That's how we'll define them. So even though, unlike the dollar weighted, we're not going to let the return measure be influenced that way, we do tend to divide the sub-periods according to when the cash flows happen. Then we calculate the holding period return. That's what I showed you at the beginning for each sub-period. And then we link, or sometimes called chain, the holding period returns, chain them all together. So we've got an overall arching long period return. And then at the end, we probably want to remember to annualize it. So let's see how that looks. So let's see how we do that. Here is the exhibit in the style of the syllabus. Same assumptions here, but we're going to get a different time-weighted return. And then notationally, you can see the time-weighted return looks this way. And this may look familiar because when the holding period returns are annual, then what we're computing here is a CAGR, or I say CAGR, which is compound annual growth rate. That's if the sub-periods are annual. So what we have here, R1 are the holding period returns, right? That's the individual holding period return. I didn't do that very well. Holding period return. Each one's different, of course. 1, 2, 3. And then we're chaining or linking them together by way of multiplication, giving us an overarching return, which we then raise to 1 over the n power, so that if the holding period returns are annual, then this is then annualizing them into the CAGR, and we subtract the 1 as a final step. So let's do that for our same exact assumptions here. You can see we're going to get 14.11%, so that if I bring the calculator back in here, and what I need to do in this is identify my sub-periods. Well, I only have 2 sub-periods from today to the end of the first period. So first subperiod to the end of the first period, second subperiod is to the end of the second period. What's my holding period for the first subperiod? Well, if I want to articulate the steps here, right, I just say open parens, I take my price of 119, I add 3, and then I could subtract 100, but I'm going to take just a shortcut here. I'm going to just close parens and then go ahead and divide by the price, so that I'm getting 1 plus the holding period return. And I just did that shortcut only because I know that I would, when I link them together, I would be adding the 1 back anyway. So rather than subtract the 100 and the holding period return, I just didn't subtract it. And what I'm getting out here is a 1 plus holding period return of 22% that I can use in my chaining or my linking. So then I'm just going to store that into 1 and then go right to my second sub period, where I insecurely clear here, which I don't need to do, but as a habit I do that. I open parens, I have 124 plus my $3 dividend, and then I close parens, taking that shortcut, dividing by the 119, which was the price at the beginning of the sub period, and I'm getting 1 plus the holding period return of 6.72%. And I just like to store that in variable 2. There may be other ways to do this. I store each of the sub periods. So that means I can go back now and link or chain them together by recalling the first sub period. That is 1 plus my holding period return, and I multiply by recalling the second, 1 plus my second sub period's holding return, equal them, and then I need to exponentiate here, raising to the 1 half, right? 1 divided by 2, which is the same as taking a square root. I could raise to the 1 half, but knowing that's a square root, I'll just hit the square root here, and I end up with 1 plus my time weighted return. So I'll just do the -1 to make that official, and I get my time weighted return of 14.11%, and it matches. Okay. So, in summary, then you might have the question, what's the better one to use? Well, the money weighted return really reflects the client's reality. But if the client is the one who makes the decision to add or withdraw the money, then it doesn't really reflect on the investment manager's isolated performance. Think of that scenario that we just looked at. Let's say I'm the one responsible for the share price performance, but you're the one who decides to purchase that additional share. You didn't need to purchase that additional share at the end of the first sub period. My performance really, while you care about my money weighted return as your actual experience, so to speak, my performance as the one who's responsible for that share price is really more reflected by the time weighted return, that time weighted return. And so for this reason, the CFA, the position is that the time weighted return, because it's not sensitive to additions or withdrawals of funds, is the preferred measure of performance. So again, if we assume that additions or withdrawals from the portfolio that's being measured here are a decision made by the client and not the investment manager, and our goal is to evaluate the performance of the investment manager, then it makes sense to use the measure which does not really account for those adjustments and withdrawals, and that measures the time weighted return. So given those 1 or 2 assumptions, we would generally say the time weighted return is the better measure of performance for the investment manager who's responsible for that performance. Okay, so finally, I'll just give you a little bit more of an elaborate, maybe more realistic example and make sure we know how to do this. And then when I show you the setup assumptions, I think it'd be a good time to pause the video and then see if you can calculate both measures on your own with the calculator. So our assumptions are that you'd like to compute the investment performance of Hot Technology Fund. I just made that name up. And on January 1st, 2018, the fund had a market value of $100 million. And then from January 1st to March 31st, so you'll notice that's the first 3 months or first quarter of the year, the fund showed a capital gain of $12 million. And at that point in time, at the end of the first quarter, so April 1st, effective for our purposes, effectively the same as March 31st, end of the first quarter, beginning of the second quarter, the fund paid a dividend of $5 million. And now, hopefully, you are alert to this assumption, which is easy to gloss over, but we need to make a note of it because it would make a difference. That $5 million dividend is going to be reinvested. And then due to its exceptional performance, institutions at that point in time invest an additional $30 million into hot technology, so on April 1st, which raises the assets under management of the fund to $147 million. How do we get there? Well, we started the year January 1st at 100. There was a capital gain of $12 million to March 31st / April 1st. There's a $5 million dividend at that point, but it gets reinvested, hence its inclusion here. And then the investor comes in, the institutional investor comes in and adds another 30. Right, so that's how we get to 147 on April 1st. And then we go the rest of the year, which is the subsequent 9 months of the year to the end of the year, December 31st, where hot technology then, the fund pays a $5.5 million dividend. And then also independently or excluding that dividend, we could say it has a market value of $158 million. So that at that point we'll pause and we're not going to liquidate the fund, but then we will then evaluate the performance over the year. What's the answer to that? What's the return in both time-weighted return or alternatively money-weighted return, which is a synonym for dollar-weighted return? Go ahead. And you can go ahead and calculate that, although I also have, if it helps in terms of my assumptions, in terms of the assumptions here, try to represent them graphically, superimposed on a calendar, right? The fund starts at $100 million value. We go to the end of 3 months. That's the end of March here. Capital appreciation brings it to 112. It pays a $5 million dividend that gets reinvested. And then the institutions come in and add another 30, and then nothing happens until the end of the year when the market value is 158, net of not including a $5.5 million dividend. So same exact assumptions. I just want to put it graphically unless it's easier to digest. And at this point then you could definitely pause the video and see if you can do the calculations. Okay, I hope that went well. The answers should be for time rate of return 30.13%, and for the dollar weighted return or money weighted return, hopefully you remember to annualize it and you would have gotten 27.5%. So let's take a look at that with the calculator and just confirm. For the time weighted return, we need the 2 holding period returns, and for the first one, that is going to be 112 plus 5. I'm going to use my shortcut, right? I could subtract 100 here and then come back and add the one later, but I'm going to use my shortcut here. Close parens, divide by 100. Gives me my 1 plus my holding period return of 17%. I'll store in 1. Then I'll go to the second sub period here, and I'll open parens. I'll have 158 plus 5.5, close parens, divide by, and here it might be tempting to go to the 112, but this 158 was really an improvement in price on the 147, wasn't it? That's really where we started April 1st. So we really want to divide by 147 there. And I'm getting 1 plus my 11.22% holding period return, which I will then store in number 2. And so then I'll come back, recall my 1 plus 17% holding period return, multiply by recall 2, 1 plus my 11.22% holding period return equals 1.30%. And then what about raising to the power or annualizing? Oh, I got lucky here. My first holding period was 3 months. My second holding sub period, 3 months. My second sub period, 9 months. They end up at 1 year. I'm already annualized just by nature, but just by definition, the fact that my sub periods add to 1 period. So I get some luck there. Subtract 1, get my time rate of return of 30.13%. Okay, so now for the money weighted return, I need to make sure I specify my net flows correctly. My first one is we could think of ourselves here. You want to put yourselves in the position of the institutional investor, investing 100 million, and then what happens? So here, I think the trickiest one is just what happens here at the end of 3 months, right? Notice my timeline, 0.25 of a year. That's a quarter of a year or 3 months. The net cash flow experience the institutional investor is, well, the fund value is a capital gain of 12 million brings the fund value to 112. Doesn't really affect me cash flow wise. The dividend of 5, remember, was reinvested, so I'm not getting that. The only thing that's happening cash flow wise is an additional $30 million being invested. So that's the only net cash flow that's happening here at the 3 months. And then we get to the end of the year where we're treating this like a cash inflow because we're evaluating our valuation of the portfolio at that point in time. So it's unrealized gain, 163.5. So now we've had our cash flows. We can use cash flow worksheet. My first step is to clear it. The first at cash flow 0 is negative 100. We enter it. We go down to cash flow. The first cash flow is 30. We negate it. And there's only one frequency of that, and then we skip to the next cash flow, and here's where it's very easy to make a mistake. This calculator is only aware that these are equally spaced periods. So in time, it doesn't know the duration or length of these time periods. It doesn't know that these are 3-month time periods. It doesn't care. We're computing an IRR. We've now entered in the first 2 cash flows. We only have 1 to go, but our periods are really 3-month periods. And for that reason, to do this correctly, we need to acknowledge that there's continuing equal spaced over time. The next period is at 0.5, and then after that it's 0.75. So we have those 2 sub-periods in between here where there are 0 cash flows, but we need to formally put those into the calculation. The fact that we had 30 million outflow at 0.25, so we need to make sure we get in a 0 at 0 cash flow at the half year point, at the 6-month interval, and a 0 cash flow at the 9-month interval. And then our final input will be the 163.5 at the 1.0. So you see how we need to enter in those zeros in order to treat them in the calculator, treat the fact that we've got all of the sub-periods entered into the calculator. Otherwise, we would surely distort this. And so this 0 at CO2 is the 6-month interval. I'll just hit enter to put that in, to enter that. And I'll treat the frequency as 1. I could use frequency 2 here to get both of my zeros in at once, but I'm not going to complicate it. I'm going to go right to CO3. That's my cash flow now at the 9-month interval, which is in years 0.75. I'm going to enter that. Frequency of 1 as well. And now finally, because my sub-periods are really 0.25 years, I'm going out to cash flow 4 to finally enter my 163.5 as an inflow. To get that in accurately, I enter that and then I'm done. And now I can compute my IRR. It's inviting me to hit compute, and I'm getting the answer. The IRR is 6.2626, or you can see it matches my Excel, 6.263% in IRR. Is that per annum? No, it's not, because again, my periods here it's actually a 3-month period. My interval here is 0.25 years. So I'm getting a valid IRR, but it's a 3-month IRR. It's a 0.25 years IRR. So in my opinion, it would be very careful. It'd be deceptive to just put that out as a label, because it would be it's reasonable to expect people to think that these are per annum numbers, right? Unless otherwise specified, we want to assume key inputs and outputs are per annum. That's a convention. So if we were to use the 6.263, we really have to be very careful to clarify that's a 3-month IRR. Better for us to annualize it because then it's more consistent with the expectations. Or use both and label it. But now I'll annualize it. And so the calculator, one of my pet peeves, the calculator, it's expressing this in percentage terms, not decimal. So I'm going to divide that by 100, get it to format that I'm more comfortable with, right? That's what that is in decimal format. And then I'll add the 1. And then I'm going to raise this to the 4th power and subtract 1. Because there are four 3-month periods in the 1 year, and I get the 27.5 annualized IRR, which I think, without any caveats or clarifications, is the better number to use. So that's the answer, and it is, you can see, different than, it's in the neighborhood, but different than the time-weighted return. And so my final question would be, if you're the investor, and if let's just say I'm the manager, I'm the one in charge of hot technology fund, which measure is the better measure according to the CFA Institute? If the purpose is, if we assume that this decision here, this $30 million decision, is your decision as the client, not my decision as the investment manager, and our goal is just to evaluate my performance as the investment manager, which measure does the CFA say is the better measure? That's right, it'd be the holding period return. And lucky me, it's slightly higher, so I'm happier anyway. So that's time-weighted return and money-weighted return. I hope the video is helpful. If it is, subscribe to the channel and you'll get notified of the next video in our series. Thank you.